where, oh, I want to play some online matches. You open up the game, you go to the main menu, you go into the online matches, and then when you go into the online lobby, then the game connects to the server. Do not do it up front when the game boots. Do not make me sign up for external accounts. Honestly, this is the most obvious one on the list, but I've seen so many people defend it for reasons I don't understand that it's going on my list. It drives me insane. Number 6 is an interesting one because there is a good idea there, but modern game developers don't know how to execute this good idea. So the good idea in concept is the idea of adaptive difficulty. The fact that the game will shift in how difficult it is based upon the player's performance. This is a very strong, powerful game design concept that I advocate for all the time on the channel in the form of rank. Arcade games figured out this design concept, and it is a powerful design concept that modern games are starting to play with. Unfortunately, the way modern games are doing adaptive difficulty is giving it a bad reputation because they are doing it wrong, in my opinion. And what they are doing is externalizing the adaptive difficulty to the player's whims and will. So you'll be playing some modern game now, and the boss is too hard, or the level is too hard, or the section is too hard, and you go, you know what, I don't want to deal with this. I go to start, I go to options, and I switch it to easy mode, and I play this difficult section on easy mode, and then I put it back to normal or hard mode, right? So the player is opening up an external menu and just flipping switches to the whims of where they want the game to be difficult or not. That is, no, don't do that. That is subverting and manipulating the intended difficulty curve of the game through external factors and whims. What you want to do is have the adaptive difficulty be integrated into the gameplay itself. I'm going to have to refer to a shmup on this one because shmups have been doing this a lot better than other genres. Battle Garega famously has this adaptive rank system. But if you want to drop the rank of the game, you can't just flip open a menu in Battle Garega and be like, you know what, I want 0 rank right now against Blackheart. That sounds good, right? Let's just put it 0 rank on Blackheart. No, you have to manipulate the adaptive difficulty of the game by choices and consequences in the game design itself. You have to do things and sacrifice things to shift how the game is performing difficulty-wise. This is the correct way to do it because it formally makes adaptive difficulty an aspect of the game's design. It makes it something the player needs to be conscious of and needs to be addressing inside the game itself, not in some menu that they just flip on and off. It is happening in the game, and you tailor your choices around this concept. This creates meaningful differences in the new player's experience and the veteran player's experience, where the veteran player is going to come in and do all kinds of stuff in the early game to build up that rank with certain payoffs and benefits. And the newer player who doesn't want to be obliterated by high difficulty is going to make different, more safe choices. And then the mid-range player is going to be somewhere in between the two. That is really good adaptive difficulty design. It is built into the functions and metagame of the game itself, and it is not just a switch you flip in a menu. Number 7, the over-reliance on meters for balance and character distinction. Remember back to when games, especially action games, didn't have meters? Imagine a modern fighting game coming out now, or a modern action game coming out now, and it doesn't have a meter. The concept is mind-blowing. The concept is like illegal. It cannot be done. Every action game, fighting game now has to have meters because it is the new way modern developers know how to balance games and how to make their characters distinct. Like, we'll put a bunch of characters in and we'll give them supers, and their supers is what makes the character distinct. But if you go back and think about a game like Street Fighter 2, the new challengers, the version of Street Fighter 2 before Super Turbo and before supers and meter, remembering back to that era of Street Fighter 2 and that era of fighting games, the characters are still extremely distinct from one another. You look at T-Hawk, Chun-Li, Cammy, Dalsum, E-Honda, M. Bison, Vega, all these different characters, even without meter, are extremely distinct from each other and have their own matchups and balance and all their own characteristics that do not rely on meter or supers or specials to make them distinct from one another. It really comes down to a lot of modern fighting games now need stuff like meters and supers to make their characters distinctive, even from their earlier versions from previous games. You take away changes from the meter-based moves and a lot of it blends together, and it makes a lot of fighting games feel very similar to one another, and it usually is the go-to method these days for developers to balance unique or interesting moves. They often don't know how to make certain moves fit into the meta of the gameplay naturally or in a way that's based off of the frame data and just internal properties of the hitboxes and startup and all that kind of thing. They're not quite sure how to balance that, so they say, let's just throw a meter on top of it, and then going back to the data-driven balance, they just watch the move in the data of the game that's presented to them and say, oh, well, the move is a little bit more powerful than we expected, so we'll just make it cost more meter. Or maybe the move isn't as good as we expected, so we'll make the move cost less meter. Akuma from Tekken 7 comes to mind here, where they're not going to fundamentally change how the move or character works, and instead they can just tweak the values of the meter, and it works functionally, kind of, but I don't think it holds up as well as more fundamental archetypal type of character balance. Street Fighter 2. There is a reason why almost every character of Street Fighter 2 turned into a fighting game archetype across multiple series in multiple other games, because they had to balance these characters before Super Turbo based off of how they work fundamentally. This is how you get a grappler or a charge character. Capcom had to figure out, okay, this guy's grab and throws are just way too powerful. How do we balance that? But we can't use a meter. Well, okay, so we have to sort of make him slow and make him vulnerable to these other characteristics so that his grappling is now the forefront of how the character functions. Same thing with charge characters. They're sitting and thinking, okay, it turns out that slow-moving projectiles is really good in fighting games because you can create all these nasty setups with this hitbox just floating in the middle of the screen. So how do we balance this exactly? And they couldn't use the meter, so they had to put this sort of charging timer type of maneuver on the input. So this is the kind of creative decision making that happened when you couldn't just slap a meter on it. These days, if you have some kind of fireball that's too good, or a grab that's too good, or some kind of move that's too good, the developer just says, I'll just throw a meter on there and call it good. Like I said before, I think it is actually creatively very stifling. A meter should be the last resort to balancing a move, in my opinion. You should try everything else you can before you just jump right to meter, especially when you get modern action games now where it's like a meter on a meter on a meter on a meter. It's just, yeah. It is not totally functioning in an elegant, intuitive fashion like something like Street Fighter 2. Number 8 on the list I've seen criticized here and there, but it's something I think should be talked about more, which is the fan fictionization of game design for legacy series, where with a lot of long-running legacy series these days, and pretty much all mainstream game series these days are legacy because it's difficult to launch a new IP these days. So most bigger franchises, think about fighting games, Tekken, Street Fighter, Guilty Gear, all very long series that have a big history to get to where they are today. And I think for a lot of developers of these big long-running series, they're kind of running low on ideas. What should we do? Where should we go? What's the next chapter for these game series? And a lot of the time what they do is they kind of run out of ideas and turn to the fan base. Well, what do you guys think? And the way it works with fan bases is that the fan base is going to be more aware of the past and history of a franchise and obviously cannot direct the future of a franchise the same way a creative team can or a creative visionary. Instead, what the fans are always going to do is go back to the well of what has already been done. even if you have like a really creative fan out there and they message, Namco or something and have this crazy cool idea for a new character or a new concept, are the devs going to take that seriously? No, they're not. What they're going to take much more seriously is the sort of lowest common denominator agreement among the fan base of, well, we really like Tifa from Final Fantasy VII, so why don't you put Tifa in Tekken 8? Wouldn't that be cool? Or why don't you put Aerith or whatever legacy character, Goku, the fans can think of? And there is something kind of fun about this in its own sort of Mugen way, but it feels ultimately, to me, creatively very stale, because how do we get new and engaging characters or game design concepts if we're constantly just rehashing what has been done before? I am quite sure that I heard that Capcom is going to be remaking the Resident Evil 1 remake. We have finally achieved remaking a remake. And of course, fans will be thrilled about this. Fans have no sort of creative standards on these sorts of things. If you ask them, fans are perfectly fine seeing the same thing repeated over and over because there's that fun novelty factor. But in the end, even the fans will lose interest on some level. Even if they don't know they're losing interest, it's just one day they wake up and they say, you know what? I'm not going to buy the Resident Evil 2 remake because I already bought that game 3 times, or I'm not going to buy the Resident Evil 6 remake because I've already bought the other 4 remakes and I'm just kind of bored of it. It's the type of interest that's there until it's not. So developers, stop listening to fans, basically. So number 9 on the list is a very bold one because it's a more unique concept that I've been thinking of. It's kind of an original idea of mine, but I think it will connect with a lot of people, which is that a lot of modern games now and games coming out now do not have entropy. They do not have consequence for the player being idle or not doing anything. Entropy is the concept. So future games, I think, will start to integrate forms of entropy. I talked about this in my classic game design video, where one major thing that classic games had that modern games don't have are timers, are things that make you progress forward in the game. And I've been thinking about this concept a lot, and I still really love the concept of introducing timers back into game design. But I think the general concept could be expanded out into this idea of entropy, where there needs to be consequence for an action. Something needs to be happening at all times, even if the player isn't doing anything. And I have an example that I think modern gamers will find interesting, even if they don't agree with it, which is the difference between like modern Zelda and something like Majora's Mask. Majora's Mask is a very popular Zelda title. It's like the hipster Zelda title. And what I think is interesting and unique about Majora's Mask that people that are fans of that game connect with is this concept of entropy, where you have to be doing something. You have to be moving forward in that game because of the whole timer cycle pushing you forward. Majora's Mask, every second counts because every second is being counted down. And yes, it's not super evil because you can reset it and all that kind of stuff. But then when you reset it, you got to redo stuff. So there still is a consequence. And another example is Pikmin 1 versus the rest of the Pikmin series. Pikmin 1, by far, is my favorite title, and I think the best title in the series because it has these timer entropy effects, where not only do you need to get stuff done during the day cycle of the map, but then you have this macro timer of you've got 30 days left, so you got to get everything done within these 30 days, and it creates a real sense of momentum and accomplishment and pressure that modern gamers right now are uncomfortable with, because everything in modern game design, because of the whole open world exploration aspects of modern game design, has shied away from. Super Mario Wonder, for example, finally got rid of the timer from the Mario series, and not a lot of people really commented on this or cared about it because the timer of the Mario series is really generous. But I think modern games need this sense of entropy because it creates meaning, it creates stakes. Right now, that isn't happening. This is not a trend that is emerging right now in game design. but I do think it will reemerge in the future. I do think game developers are going to pick up on this concept of, hey, we talk about how every move you make in a game matters, except if you just set the controller down and then nothing matters. Isn't that kind of a dumb concept? Even from their whole immersive viewpoint, it isn't very immersive if you can break the entire logic of the game by simply setting down the controller. And that ties back to my first point of micromanaging the player's pace, where even if you want to micromanage the player's pace, you have to do something about them not doing anything. And then finally, we have number 10 on the list, if you can't guess what it is from the thumbnail, which is progression for progression's sake. And yes, I am skeptical of how progression is used in video games these days a lot, because I think it is a commonly abused concept in modern game design. But even in terms of progression and accepting it as, okay, this can kind of work in certain genres and in certain game design concepts, the big thing I have a real problem with that we see abused all the time, constantly, is progression for progression's sake. Basically, it's just this unwritten rule that if you want your game to be a serious game and a deep game, there needs to be progression elements in it. Even if those progression elements are useless, pointless, and a waste of time, they still need to exist because that shows that the player is getting ownership over the game, or it's immersive, or blah, 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 blah. Progression for progression's sake is a big one for me, because not only is it something that every game just does these days because it feels it has to, but also because if you're one of the few bold developers who decides, no, I'm not going to do progression for progression's sake, I'm going to give you the game and its true identity right up front. A recent example that comes to mind is the 2D beat-em-up Slave Zero X, where Slave Zero X decided, no, we're not going to do this move unlocking meta progression garbage that most other action games do. Instead, you're going to have all your moves right at the beginning of the game, which I thought was very cool and refreshing, and I saw being widely critiqued among pretty much all the other reviews. Every other reviewer felt, well, it's just, this is how it's done. You just have to play the game to unlock all the moves because the player's going to be overwhelmed by the amount of options. But the thing that a lot of these critics and game designers don't seem to understand is the concept of legacy skill. You'll see this in character action games, even from the PS2 era, even character action games that I really love, like Devil May Cry 3 and Ninja Gaiden 2. You boot those games up for the first time, Devil May Cry 3, Dante Must Die ain't there. You need to unlock Dante Must Die, and even if you've played the game 100 times before, you got to play through it on all these other modes to finally get to your Dante Must Die. Same thing with Ninja Gaiden 2 Master Ninja. You need to go through the entire campaign like 3 times to finally get Master Ninja unlocked. But what if I already know how to play Ninja Gaiden 2 and I want to play it on my Xbox One X in enhanced mode? Now I have to play through the game over and over again for basically no reason. But I think single player games need to be more aware of this, because we need to go back to the essential question of what is the purpose of a progression system in terms of game design? What should a progression system accomplish? In my opinion, what a progression system should accomplish is making every playthrough of the game meaningfully different from one another based off the decisions of the players. So let's look at 2 basically different examples of progression systems, which are Devil May Cry 3 versus Pokemon Red. And I tried to use very universal, simple examples. So Pokemon Red is that classic RPG progression system where as you go through the game, you level up your Pokemon, and as your Pokemon level up, you have to choose their moves. And the thing about what makes Pokemon's progression system good is that there are limitations to it, and there are meaningful different branching paths that happen every single playthrough. So if you're going through and you're leveling up your Charmander or whatever Pokemon it is, you have to choose what moves it learns and what moves it uses that replace other moves. That limitation of only having 4 moves available for your Pokemon at any given time makes every playthrough a different branching path, where every playthrough you're giving your Pokemon different sets of attacks at different times And each time you change what Pokemon you use and what attacks that Pokemon use and where you grind and where you level up, that shifts the dynamic of the playthrough. And you are meant to play through the game every single time, beginning with no Pokemon and selecting your starter. And so Pokemon Red, in my opinion, is an example of a simple but well done progression system in a game. In Devil May Cry 3, however, as much as I love the game, the progression system is a hot mess because it does not function in the same way of making every playthrough meaningfully different from one another. And I know what you're thinking. Well, actually, no, because when you start the game, you collect red orbs and then you use the red orbs to buy moves. And so you're actually buying moves and choosing which moves to buy and all that kind of thing. But the problem is that the normal mode of Devil May Cry 3 is not the true game. If I reviewed Devil May Cry 3 and only played normal mode and critiqued the game based off of only my experience in normal mode, every Devil May Cry fan in the universe would reject my review, and rightly so. And they would all say, well, no, the real version of Devil May Cry 3 is playing for S ranks on Dante Must Die. And I agree. The real version of Devil May Cry 3 is playing for S ranks on Dante Must Die. That is the game at its peak. That is what the game is supposed to be. But the progression system has no bearing on this experience. It only gets in the way of this experience because if you get to Dante Must Die, you've already completed the progression system. It's already done. It no longer matters in any sort of way. The progression system of Devil May Cry 3 is just a hurdle you jump over to get to the true game. There is no meaningful decision making that impacts how the game plays in the long run. It's just purely homework. The progression system of Devil May Cry 3 need not exist. And in fact, a really funny subversion of this is in Devil May Cry 4 recently. Capcom put out this like DLC type of thing you can buy that just unlocks the entire game. You can just go in and buy Devil May Cry 4's true game, essentially, and save you all the busy work of unlocking Dante Must Die and unlocking the characters and all that. And funnily enough, I don't think this should be sold. I think it's grimy to sell this function to the player, but I do think this should be an essential function if the game has a fake progression system. And once upon a time, developers in their own way sort of recognize this by including cheat codes to get around their fake progression systems. And I think that needs to come back. And so even if modern developers aren't willing to just upfront give you everything unlocked, which I think they should, but even if they're kind of weary about that and they want to kind of push the players through the fake progression system, they should have in there somewhere some function that the legacy players can activate to get around it, whether it's just going into the options menu and in advanced settings, there's like this thing you flip and it unlocks everything. Or if you have to literally put in the Konami code or whatever it would be, something, anything to get around this progression for progression's sake, which is very different from a classic RPG where you are supposed to start at 0 every single time and then branch through the progression system as you progress through the game. And so these are my 10 short-term game design trends that I do not think will hold up in the future. And if you like this style of video, I have another one that I think you will enjoy, which is why games don't feel classic anymore. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, tell all your friends. I am going full-time very soon, like within weeks. So if you are so inclined, please, if you can, support the channel's Patreon. Keep an eye out. I'm going to be doing a merch t-shirt drive next week and then some fundraising streams. Just doing a lot within the next month to prepare myself for this switch into full-time because this is my true passion. I'm in it for the long haul. Thanks so much. Adios, everyone.
So thank you to the $5 patrons, 100, Absconditis, Accepting Panda, Admiral Coconut, Anhold, AJA, Alexander Pfeiffer, Analgesic Productions, Anthony A, Arcade Hell, Arrow Viper, Au Alai, Autonamed, Beelit, Beam Pit, Bo, Beto Dames, Boghog, Board Basmati, Borgie22, Chase Palumbo, Chris Yusufovich, Christopher R, Chronic Burnout 3, Claire Cliff, Clay Binkley, Climby Coyote, Coast, Colorboy, Cooksan666, Cooks and Soup, Des Audio, Dances with Incels, Darren Griffin, Dave Hansen, David Andrus, David Crespo, Delta Tango 6, Dingo, DJ420 Praise It, Drano, Dr. Bosky, Elbin Senesev, Elias Alonso, Eric Houdini, FCK, F Deluxe, Friskin, Frames Per Human, Francisco, Freckle Lord, Full Set, Game Boy Guru, Geese Machine, GPM, Gustavo Sanchez, Haroon Khan, Hausu, Hero Death, Hiki Hime, HUD, JDab, Jake Ryan, Jack Walsh, Jacob Valenzuela, JLab, JBRPG, Jeffel, Jink Hans, John Kelly, John Longwalker, Josh Mayer, Jurgen, K, K2, Contain, Praise the Boys, Lord Harrington, Lorraine, Malaise, Mario Simic, Mark Sloan, Mars Bar, Matt O'Leary, Maz, Minung, Meister, Mujam, Milo Shamel, Monroe, Nathaniel Davis, Neon Decker Games, Nile Agitis, Okla Kugels, Powell Parole, Pedro Perez, Poorly Written Protagonist, Psycho Blizzard, Queen Charlene, Ralph Trujillo, Raul,